Good
Should be
morning,
good to go.
good afternoon. I'm Jill Shapiro with the Global Government Affairs Office at Tenable, the cyber exposure company. Tenable is proud to be part of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, a coalition of more than 70 companies and growing, working together to establish best practices to improve the security, stability, and resilience of cyberspace. Last year, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord announced a new partnership with the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. To further the commitment of this partnership, the Tech Accord launched a series of webinars on cybersecurity best practices. Today's webinar will be hosted by Bill Olsen, Tenable's technical director, who will discuss best practices for addressing the ever-growing challenge of managing vulnerabilities. If you have questions during the webinar, feel free to ask them in the chat box, and Bill will reserve time to answer them at the end of the session. As many of you may know, Tenable provides solutions to assess, manage, and measure cyber risk across on-prem, cloud, container, and OT environments. The company also provides analytics for measuring and communicating cyber risk, helping to make better strategic decisions to improve security posture. With that, I will turn the call over to Bill.
All right, Jill, thank you very much. This is a whole new year. And as my youngest picture showed, I am not as young as you think I am. I have been doing this for more than 20 years, working in this industry for a long time. Between working at Qualys for almost 10 years and my 5th year here at Tenable, and prior to that, working for a boutique company in New Jersey, this has been a long ride for me, especially around vulnerability scanning, pen testing, doing all of these management processes. What I have to say is each year, I really do think that this is the year that I'm going to have to find a new job or a new career. I think each year going into it that this problem is going to be solved and people won't need webinars like this anymore, or to talk to people about what works and what doesn't work, because it's going to be resolved. Every year for 20 years that hasn't happened, but maybe we could actually talk about how to do that. As I said, I'm old, and I remember the Wayback Machine. In fact, I remember this product. ISS was first started in 1994. So in the early to mid 90s, this web page, the earliest one that I can find, is from 1996 in December. So, more than 20 years ago, these guys built this awesome Too Cool for School web page. An amazing piece of software that they built. These guys were really pioneers. They made scanning into something. They really built a business around giving people visibility into what was happening inside of their environment. And a lot has changed in the last 20 years when we look back on the 90s. I remember this. This was a revolutionary moment. If you didn't know where you were going in the old days, you need to have a map and a finger and figure out where you were going. Nowadays, when this came out, you didn't need a map and a finger. You actually could go in, put in an address, and it would print out step-by-step instructions for you. And that was a huge, big benefit for people to have. Nowadays, we have GPS on our wrist. We've got GPS in our car. We have GPS on our phone. And in many cars, and some cars here in the US, a lot of cars, GPS is a standard or some way to talk to the GPS that you already have in your environment. These things have been revolutionized what we've done. Something like this is also from the 90s. This is a compact ProLiant server. Look at them awesome drives that you had inside. They were amazing pieces of hardware that you actually had to start with a floppy disk to get the firmware going, get the system built up so that you could actually start a business. And if you wanted to build something, you would have to buy the system, wait for it to be shipped, rack it, and get it all set up, then load the operating system. Obviously with things like this, you don't need to do anything along those lines. The guys at Instagram, 13 people had their idea. They're from 100,000 to over 1 million users in less than 2 months. And then $1 billion sale a couple years later. Yeah, if we all could have ideas like that, this would be we would not be on these webinars. We'd be on some fancy beach overall. And then last but not least, Blockbuster. Now, before I got into the tech industry, I used to work retail and had days off, weird days off like a Tuesday or a Wednesday in the middle of the week because you had to work weekends a long time ago. And I loved Blockbuster and video stores because they were great. You could get just enough couch time, just enough time to sit on the couch, watch a video or two, grab lunch, sit off, relax, have your day off, and move on. But technology has marched forward, and with things like Netflix, holy moly, I think these guys are in business with the people that make couches. We are destined to replace our couches significantly faster. Before, you couldn't make a dent with Blockbuster. Now you could totally wear out a couch in a matter of weeks with the amount of content that we could watch and how many hours or days that we can continue to watch these shows over and over again. Now, not everything needs changing. Things like the wheel, they work out very, very well, and you can continue to use them, maybe slightly improve them. But when we look at things like vulnerability management, it really hasn't changed. And we have lots and lots of challenges, and people are stuck. And you can almost argue that we're in the kind of prehistoric times with how things have gone or not gone or improved over the last several years. And you could argue over the last 20 years. We probably started with CSV files, and we still continue with them today. Everybody loves the CSV. Working for a vendor, whether it was Qualys or here at Tenable, the amount of time that people spend inside of CSVs to track what's happening in their environment still boggles my mind. It's the preferred way that people communicate. Maybe it's the right way. Maybe there's not been a better way invented yet. Maybe it's the way that we've always done it, so that's the way we'll always do it. It just seems amazing that what we used 20 years ago is still what we're using today when you think back at some of the challenges that we have, the challenges that have been solved over the last 20 years with technology. I've also seen crazy things like this. We have unbelievably complicated process flow maps. Now, I don't know if this one's real. I stole this from a friend of mine's slide deck. But I just think it's hysterical, especially down at the bottom where it says them versus the customer in the chat. But people do make very, very complicated processes around building a vulnerability management program. So I think it's a time to think about what you can do to make this better. So hopefully everybody can still hear me because I cannot check. Jill or Michelle would have texted me or emailed me and told me that they can't. So I'm looking at my phone, so everything looks okay because they're not sending me any messages. So that seems good. So could this be the year that you guys put me out of a job? I hope so, because I might want to do something else in my life and go do something different than rather talk about vulnerability management and the challenges that people have around it. I do think that if we all spend a few minutes of our daily lives thinking about things in perhaps different ways, foreshadowing for a slide in the future, thinking about how we could change what we do or how we interact with people, these are ways that we could maybe put me out of a job, which I would like. So it's like old school win Ben Stein's money. All right, so if we're going to build a process, what do we want to talk about? Building things is not easy, especially when there's a lot of things to consider. People inside of your environment, the technologies that you're using, how your environments are changing, who we're talking to, what we say to them, the words we use, the tools that we interact with. All of these things make building a vulnerability management program a complicated problem, but it isn't hard. It isn't impossible. It's hard, but it isn't impossible. And I do think it all starts with a goal in making sure that we're all on the same page and we all understand what we're trying to achieve. And to go back in time, when I were back at that previous company, I said their name twice, that's enough for them. We're back at the previous company. I had a lot of different positions, and I got moved into a role called the SME. And I thought it was funny because I didn't even know what SME stood for back then. And the role, maybe you know, it's a subject matter expert. And what I thought it was going to be is all about knowing what buttons do. Like this button does this, and this button does that, and this is how you make this go, and so on and so forth. To be the product expert, the button expert, the guy who knew all the buttons. And one of my first meetings, I was with a financial organization, and they were in the second and a half year of their 3-year contract. And they were saying, look, we used this other vendor for 3 years. We hated them. We threw them out. And then we went to this other vendor and we had them for 3 years. We didn't like them and we threw them out. And now we're 2.5 years with you. And, we're thinking about throwing you out as well. And the conversation then went around with, hey, we need an orange button. We need green twiddly knobs. And, the screen should be this big instead of that big. And this icon should be over here. And it was very feature specific and not really about trying to understand what we were doing or what they were trying to accomplish. So I stopped the conversation and I said to him, I said, well, what's the goal of your vulnerability management program? What problem are you trying to solve? And I broke it down on the fly to these 4 things. And I've actually stuck with this now for the better part of 10 years. Now, I realize that risk and threat are very, very close together. But in my simple mind, I like to divide them into 2 ways. And I'll talk about that in a second. But I like to think about them differently. And when I've talked to people over the years, I've asked them, well, what do you think is the most difficult to do? And people always come up with different answers. I'll define these in a second. And also, people also ask, what's the easiest one to do? And also, I get different answers. And I think it's worth taking a second and really thinking about what's the goal of the program. And when I asked the gentleman what his answer was, he said, I don't know. Maybe we should go get the CISO. And we said, all right. So he was the director, and we went and got the CISO. Now, these 2 gentlemen had worked together for the better part of 9 years. They've been together working with one another at the same company for a very, very long time. They were in one another's weddings. They've been to kids, bar mitzvahs and birthdays. They know one another. They're friends. They're buddies. They certainly work together. You would think that they would be completely in tune. So when we asked the CISO what the answer to the question is, of course, he said all of the above, or, sometimes people take, well, we need to reduce risk, or we need to, prevent breaches. They make these statements, and, reducing risk is not a goal, right? Because it's not SMART. It's not generally specific, measurable, the whole acronym. And it's not clear what you're trying to achieve. And I would argue that 4 of these things for most companies is not an achievable goal, trying to do all 4 of these things. And as I said, I'll define these in just a second. But unless you have 4 different teams, each concentrating in different ways, because they do require different disciplines. So let's talk about each one of these for a minute. The risk management, this one is where most organizations try to start. And I would argue that that's a huge failure. And it's almost destined to fail with their program, because doing a risk-based approach is unbelievably challenging unless you have a tremendous amount of information and buy-in from the organization. Being able to perform a business impact analysis and really truly understand how the business works and where the risks are in the business and what are the risks. Okay, someone's telling me they can see and hear me. Good, so things are going good. So where the risks are inside the environment are all a tremendous challenge. Being able to put this on paper, being able to relate that when this happens, this is how much money it's going to cost us, requires an incredible amount of discipline, an incredible amount of data. And frankly, when you're dealing with IT systems, there have been a couple blog posts about this over the last 10 years. People have argued that it's nearly impossible to do because of the dependencies that one system has on the routers, the switches, the firewalls, the internet connection, the people that connect it, the third-party software vendors. The list of things make it virtually impossible to develop a truly risk-based approach, because it has to do risk, you have to be talking about dollars. Whereas threat, now I realize they're very close tied together. My little brain, though, I break them up. Whereas threat is not necessarily tying into the dollar, like if we did this, we would reduce our cost by this, or we would reduce our risk by this. This is really taking a look at a threat-based approach inside of an environment and saying, we have all these threats inside of our environment. What are the ones that are likely to be exposed? What are the ones that are likely to be poked at? What are the ones that we should really focus our energy on? And if you're an old Star Trek fan, where should we put the shields? Should we put the shields in the front of the ship, or should we put the shields in the back of the ship? Okay, good. So hopefully Jill says she's been trying to get in and out, but she keeps getting kicked out. That's what's happening to me as I keep getting kicked out. I think it had something to do with someone was saying Jill was half the presenter and I was half the presenter. So moving along, threat management can be a much easier way to tackle the problem. And I would argue is where organizations, if they're truly trying to do a risk-based approach with trying to do risk management, they should really rethink that and look at a threat-based approach and understand what the vulnerabilities, what the systems are, and kind of stop there versus trying to understand that this is going to generate this much or save this much money or prevent this much cost to the organization, to be purely, and I'm making air quotes, to do a pure risk-based approach. People blend the two together often, but sometimes they get pretty mixed up and they confuse the two to the point where it challenges the program and people start to wonder if it's a value. Security intelligence is really simply what is it, why is it here, and what does it do? Using the scanning technology, the vulnerability management solution to provide that visibility in the organization is a cornerstone of building a security program. The SANS top 20 or whatever they call it now, the Australian top 5, et cetera, they all highlight building an inventory of systems and software is the first step. If you don't know what you have, you can't build a strategy to protect it. So using your program to just build this awareness is a good thing. Creating a metric to just highlight, how effective what you have inside of your environment is a really good metric to have. So I don't discount that one. The one at the bottom, people always turn their nose up at, but that's the win. If you ask me, that's the easy win for everybody, because this shows a quick understanding of how effective what's happening in your environment. And we're actually going to talk a lot about this one as we move on, about security patch auditing. And this is just evaluating how effective your programs are inside. It's an audit, and that's why I put the word audit there. So a lot of people will think they have a good idea, and a lot of people will think everybody is on the same page. And I would challenge you to ask around. You're at the beginning of a new year. Maybe you're purchasing a new tool. Maybe you're evaluating new technologies. This would be a good time to, stop and think. Do you need to lose 20 pounds? Do you need to work out more? Hopefully you keep going with the diet, or you keep going with what's happening inside of your environment, but you're making the changes that you have. And the first way you do that is by asking, are we doing the right things? Are we measuring the right things? Are we evaluating it the right way? Is everybody looking at the problem the same way? Are all the oars of the ship rowing in the same direction? Most of the time, people's problems with vulnerability management have very little to do with the technology and everything to do with everything around it. So that's where I think you have to spend the most of your time. Recognizing that the symptoms, I like this little graphic, the symptoms, they seem like the thing that you want to look at. But the problem is the core, right? Is really understanding where is that happening. And to do that, you have to evaluate, do these root cause analysis. Now, I'm not talking about, evaluating why a system fell over when you scanned it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. But really evaluating what's happening inside of your environment and thinking about these challenges and taking a few minutes of your day to, perform these RCAs. So I'd like you to think about a couple different things right now. So the first question I'd ask you is why patching doesn't happen. So if you think about that for a second, why doesn't patching happen in your environment? And I've been talking to people all over the world. I've talked about vulnerability management programs in Croatia, in the Philippines, in the Czech Republic, all over the United States, in Mexico, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, the list goes on. I've been blessed to get to travel all over the place and see lots and lots of hotel rooms. Not lots and lots of things, maybe a few things from the plane, but lots and lots of hotels, and talk to a lot of people. And I have resolved it down to a few core things that are really important that you acknowledge. The first and foremost is you can't find the owner. Now, the traditional systems that you might have in your data center can be simple, or they can be incredibly complicated. You have one asset that has three owners. One person owns the database, one person owns the web server, one person owns the operating system. People have been trying to solve for this for years. They've been creating manual spreadsheets that say, this type of application goes to Sally, and this type of thing goes to Bob. And then someone like me walks into the room and says, what's .NET? Is this an OS or a patch? Or a third-party application or an application. And then this gets more complicated, and the organization says, well, for John's team on the web side, that .NET is an OS patch, and he manages those. But for Fred's team on the other web team, .NET is a third party, and Fred doesn't manage that. He needs to bring in a third-party developer who manages the app and builds it out, and they need to validate and test and make sure that it's there. It's incredibly complicated. It is not an easy thing. And I have been telling anyone that will listen to me for years and years and years that if before I go off and someone puts me out of a job, the vendors themselves need to figure out how to be better at this for the customers, because it's clear that this is a challenge that needs to be solved, and I think technology can play a very large part in it. I won't tell you too much about what Tenable is doing here, but because to steal our thunder for later in the year, but we are definitely working on this problem, helping people find the owner. But that's the traditional data center. What if you have a very modern environment where you have systems in the cloud, or you have systems that are microserviced, or you're building container? You know, having the ability to find the owner of a physical asset or even a virtual system that has multiple owners was a tremendous challenge. Just imagine if you try to apply the same problem solving to what you had been doing to find the owners to these modern asset types. It becomes that much harder for each organization. Excuse me. It can't stop. You can't put it aside. And in fact, you should be tracking it as part of your metrics, as part of everything that you do inside of your environment, where you highlight that these are the things that Fred's doing or Fred hasn't done, and these are the things that Sally has or hasn't done, that you have an unknown inside of your environment. And you keep promoting people to that there's this whole pile of unknown things inside of our environment. And if that number just keeps getting bigger and bigger, two things. Number one, great. Maybe you're finding more stuff and you're scanning things that you didn't scan before. More on that later. But maybe it is highlighting with people that your business is growing at such a rapid rate that people don't care. They're just bypassing all of the policies, procedures, and things like that. Maybe that's highlighting that you have too many policies and procedures if people are going around them to beat your system. So you have to figure out what it is, and you need to be able to show that in a clear way. So that's one big reason you can't find the owner. Another is that you can't patch the system. Maybe it breaks the application. Maybe you're out of support. Maybe you can't afford the downtime. These are critical things that prevent that system from being patched or that vulnerability from being remediated. Those need to be tracked as well, and they need to be displayed inside of some report or dashboard or some view that gives people a clear understanding that there are things that are in scope that we're handling and things that are out of scope that are handled, but they're not being patched. But we know about them and they're clearly handled. I'm not talking about accepting the risk. Maybe that's what you do about it, but I'm talking about getting them off the list of things that people can't do. Highlighting someone saying that, hey, you know, Bob hasn't patched the system week after week after week, when it can't be patched, isn't making friends with Bob. So you need to be clearly a way to separate these things out. And if you do start doing all of these things, if you start taking a moment and thinking about each one of these challenges, you can actually start to understand where the challenge is in the organization. What isn't working well? Is it people, process, or technology? You know, maybe Bob does a really good job and Sally doesn't. Why? Does Bob have better tools? Does Bob have better people? Does Bob have a better process? Does Bob have better technology? Being able to separate these things out and evaluate them in a non-emotional, non-threatening, non-scorecardy way is the way you really can show people what's working inside and how we could elevate overall. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a little bit because I lost that 10 minutes up front. But the idea is that we want to be able to separate these things out and I highlight them inside of an organization in different places. Another problem that we have inside of organizations, and I cannot believe I was seeing people in 2018 still doing this, is they wait. Patching doesn't happen until scans happen. A scan runs, and then we tell people to patch. A scan runs, and then we tell people to patch. A scan runs, we create a report, and we tell people to patch. That to me sounds like a project. Projects have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Vulnerability management is a program. It is not a project. It does not have an end. And if you keep doing this, you might be successful for the short term, but you are doomed in the long term. And perhaps, I'm hoping, 98% of the people on the phone don't have this problem. But as I said, in my travels last year, and hopefully not in my travels in 2019, I have still seen giant enterprises, Fortune 500, Global 2000 organization, and I ask the question, what drives patching? They say scanning. Scans drive patches. That can't be the case. You can't do that going forward. You need to be free. You need to run free. No, the idea is that you should have paper drive patching. Paper, what I mean is a policy. Like a policy drives patching. So when Microsoft releases patches, whatever their day is nowadays, when they release patches, when Oracle releases a patch, they release their monthly cycle, you have a paper policy that says, when these patches are released from these vendors, we plan to release them, deploy them in our environment in X number of days. I don't care what what those days is. I don't care if it's 30 days, 20 days, 5 days, 50 days, doesn't matter. As long as the policy is written and people start working towards achieving that policy, that's how you could move forward and building that policy. And doing so, you can become more proactive in what's happening inside of your environment. Now, in vulnerability management world, there's a very few days in the world where it's not going to be reactive. And that's okay, that we are going to have to be reactive. There's this vulnerability, the Adobe one that just popped up the other day. All of these things are going to force us to be reactive. There's no getting away from it. And that's an okay thing. But if all you're doing is putting out fires all the time, you're not working smarter. You're not just working harder. And it really makes the program suffer. And people start to wonder, well, why are we doing this? What is it measuring? Are we doing the right thing? Is it any value? Do we get what we're supposed to get out of it? Let's change vendors. That'll solve our problem. All of these things, it's not the case. If you are a step back, ask yourself those questions. Are you tracking those things in the right way in your reports? It will make a difference. It really will. And it will allow you to become more proactive in what's happening inside of your environment. All right, so let's talk ticketing. Now, what you can't see in my picture on the slides that we couldn't see for the first 10 minutes is I'm not a tall man in any way, shape, or form. I'm as tall as Darren Sproles from the football game yesterday. I'm not very tall, but I carry a soapbox around with me. And this is one of the soapbox items that I carry around, if you didn't already figure it out. I carry a soapbox around, and ticketing is one of the biggest ones that I like to pick on. Ticketing, people think, is the ultimate. If we could just integrate vulnerability management into ticketing, all of our problems would be solved. Really? That's my answer to that. Really. This is a major, be careful what you wish for a moment in time. You know, because you could be destined to crazy spreadsheets that look like this or worse. And in fact, if you're doing vulnerability management tied to ticketing, and that's what executes effort, you're doing what we just highlighted wrong. We just said that if you're having to wait for patches to be applied, to have vulnerability scans run, and then a ticket gets created, then people go off and do the patches, you're just playing this giant game of whack-a-mole. It is not being anybody's friend. There are tremendous challenges with doing it that way. Just do the math with me for a second. Imagine you're an organization that has 60,000 desktops. Adobe releases a vulnerability that on all 60,000 desktops. What do? Do you create one ticket and 60,000 occurrences of that ticket? That's maybe a way to do it. Well, that means that ticket's never going to close, because the likelihood that you're going to be able to remediate all 60,000 of those workstations is zero. Some are going to disappear. Some are going to get retired. Some are can't get patched. Some are you can't scan them. They disappeared. They fell off the earth. You know the story. 60,000 is a huge number. Systems are going to get re-imaged. The old vulnerability is going to come back again. It's just a ticket. It's a nightmare. That's not a great way of looking at the problem. Well, all right, well then let's open 60,000 tickets, one for each instance. That way we can close them as we go. Well, that's a great way of doing it if you're not paying someone like IBM or a third-party vendor per ticket. They would love this day, right? So you have this. I remember this is I am not exaggerating this story. I was working with a major drug company in 2008. We had just deployed that other vendor. So we're talking 10 years ago, 2008. They had just deployed the other vendor, and I just went through that scenario. Pick one. Do you want one ticket, 60,000 occurrences, or 60,000 tickets? I'm not exaggerating. This is no lie. The person who worked for the help desk was an IBM employee, not even an employee of this major drug company. Got up on the conference table. I'm not talking about kneeling or putting their hands on the conference table. They literally stood on the conference table and started screaming at people. We can't work like this. Why would you do this to us? Our metrics would be screwed. I swear. Our metrics would be, he did swear. Our metrics would be hosed. We cannot do any of these things. This is a non-starter. It doesn't work. Happens regularly. People look at this as the ultimate. Get tickets, we'll have this problem solved. Well, how do you deal with the ownership problem? I don't have time to go on and on, but this is a huge pain that people have to consider. There is light at the end of the tunnel, though. There really is light here, and this would be a way to do ticketing the correct way, or in Bill Olsen's way. Maybe I call it the correct way. You see, one of them donuts is wrong. Actually, two of them donuts are bad. If you imagine the Lucille ball with the chocolates going down the conveyor belt, or anything where you're assessing the quality of these things are going down the line. Many of these donuts worked out perfectly. They are all in line. They have all been patched with inside of our policy. They have all been tested. They are not out of compliance. They're doing what they're supposed to. But that one donut that looks funky and that white donut that didn't flip over, those are problem donuts. Let's open tickets for those. So instead of opening 60,000 tickets, we open 2 tickets, one for each one of these. And that's it. You open the tickets for systems that are past your policy. So if your policy is 30 days on these assets for these vulns, those are the tickets you open. If you do something like that, you got a chance. You really do have a chance overall. So I got to go faster. So let's talk about measuring the right things. Now, knowing the height of your truck is a really important thing, especially if you're renting the truck, because they remind you when you drive away that you're responsible for it. But people look at this number all the time. They think that there's this goal that they can achieve 0. We can get to 0 vulns. We can have 0 systems inside a 0. Now, put PCI away for a second. PCI is a pain. PCI is, I would argue, not the best way of doing it. I think it had some good ideas, but you're supposed to get to 0 once in a 30-day period. I think the spirit of the law and the letter of the law are a challenge. But put that aside. There are still people walking around in 2018 that think that they can eliminate all of their vulnerabilities. They can eliminate all of their threats. They can eliminate all of their risk. This is a misnomer. If you're working in an organization like this, you have a challenge to figure out how to help people inside the organization to see what's going on in a different way. Also, counting vulnerabilities is a no-win game. I still see people doing this over and over and over again, where they're counting how many vulnerabilities they have in an individual basis. It just doesn't work. You're going to fail with this old school methodology. But yet, as I said, in 2018, still saw customers that were comparing themselves by counting vulnerabilities. There are significantly better metrics out there. And again, I would look towards modern technology to see, Are we building, smart goals, the specific, measurable, achievable, that are relevant and time bound? And more importantly, can we do it in an automated fashion? One of the reasons why people have done so well with the Fitbit and the smart watches and all these other things besides me, they're automatic. They make measuring things simple. They make displaying things simple. You can see immediately, are you inside your goal or outside your goal? How much more do you have to achieve your goal? And the goal allows you to set based on the data inside your environment. And that's why Apple, my watch, today's Monday, it told me, hey, based on last week, you should set your move goal here. And I think those types of ways of using data, big data, data analytics, data lakes, pick some fancy word that you want, using the data to transform behavior is an advantage here. But counting vulnerabilities is not a way to do that overall. I think people need to think about that. Okay, so we're not looking at this slide because Donald Rumsfeld's politics are something to be thought about. But to talk about politics for a second, in vulnerability management, you have to acknowledge that they exist. That's the first step to solving this problem. You want to know and talk to people in a way, and I tell people my advice here is to think about kindergarten. What is it? How do you want to be treated? And to treat people the same way. We all learned those lessons in the early days of our lives. And, calling people out, making fun of people, doing bad things, walls of shame. They have places in some areas in organizations, but generally they do way more harm than good. But that's not why I'm talking about this slide or Donald Rumsfeld. I think this guy gave us one of the best proverbs of the modern time. There are known knowns and unknown unknowns and known unknowns. And his whole thing about that I thought is hysterical. Because for me, what it's really shown is that we need to take a few minutes in life and think about this type of picture, and understand what we have inside of our environment. And again, in 2018, I met many, 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 many customers that were scanning known IP addresses. And what that means is that they got a list of IPs from the network guys and said, these are the servers that are alive this week. Scan these IPs. So they would scan, .17, .18. They would go to .22, skipping 19, 20, and 21, and go to 24 and skipping 23 and 20. Scanning just a list of known IPs. In 2018, how is that possible? How are we only scanning what people tell us we should be scanning? That's crazy. We should be totally, looking at security like how I manage my checkbook. If I never look, I never know how bad it is. Can't we do that anymore? We need to be looking at our environments in the most complete way as possible. There are ways to do this with technology today. There are integrations that you can, people they only want to scan knowns because they're concerned about maybe knocking something over. Maybe you're in a hospital and your MRI machine doesn't like to be scanned. I get it. MRI machines generate hundreds of thousands of dollars for the hospital a week. Keeping that thing running is important. But people need to be aware that if you're not scanning everything, you don't know the whole picture. And that's still happening in 2018, hopefully not 2019. The other thing to talk about is authentication. Now, this has improved dramatically over the last couple of years, but it is still way low for most organizations, the percentage of systems that they are fully evaluated via authenticated scans. Now, I get it. I understand what people think about with security. We don't want the domain creds available to the scanning system. The scanning system's in the cloud. That's a bad, scary thing. The scanner guy knows the domain admin password. That doesn't make any sense. I get all of that. But if you're in a place like that, there are still ways to solve that problem that you can work through it. And most of the time you can integrate with one of the PAM technologies, the privileged access management systems, the Psychotics, the Liebermans, the CyberArks of the world. They're even less expensive systems that some vendors even integrate with. We are working with a number of those to solve for that. Because I agree, if you have one copy of something, it's easy to keep it secure. As soon as you make multiple copies, it becomes that much harder. But these technologies give you that visibility. But if you aren't doing authenticated scanning, are you tracking that as a metric inside of your environment, saying that we have 100 systems, we only authenticate against 30 of them, so that leaves 70% of our systems unauthenticated and largely unknown? That may be a way to drive people's behavior to show that. So being able to talk about it and visualize it inside the environment is a big thing. I love these signs. Hopefully I'm not on in a hospital someday and looking at one of those things that's controlling something vital to keep me alive, and it blue screens, or now I guess orange screens of death. But these things are everywhere, right? We have connected systems everywhere, and sometimes they're resilient, sometimes they're not resilient. But these are systems, this resiliency kind of plays into the whole conversation from before, that we're not, we can't scan everything because we might knock something over. So we can only scan the known IP addresses. I think we need to embrace this overall. Years ago, I worked with a company that set a security intelligence kind of goal for their program. They wanted to scan 100% of their environment within a year. They knew that they had more than 150,000 assets, and they were only assessing about 10% of those, or less than 15,000 systems on their vulnerability management program. So they started a program, told everybody, hey, on Thursday, we're going to start scanning everything, and let us know if something goes wrong. So as soon as they did that, they ran scans. They didn't get through anything, barely, comparatively to the whole 150,000. And wouldn't you know it, all of the email and the switchboard lit up. Oh, you must be scanning, my system broke. You must be scanning, my system broke. The system is slow. It must be a scan. And all of these things. And sure enough, that bubbled up to the executive of the organization, and the executive said, stop scanning. You could not scan. Scanning is breaking things. And they were like, look, we didn't scan we maybe scanned another 2,000 systems. But we didn't scan everything. Yeah, and so it couldn't be us. And they said, well, how do you know? And they said, well, give us a week and we'll figure that out. And sure enough, they put together a quick little app that allowed anyone in the organization to put an IP address in and see if when their system was scanned, and if in fact the outage disruption related to the scan. And wouldn't you know what happened? It didn't have anything to do with scanning. Sure, there are some things that don't like to be scanned, period. I get it. But in many, many cases, the resiliency that exists in the world today is much higher. So you can add, if you create a way of a way to help people to make that transparent, to see what's happening, what's being scanned, how it's being scanned, who's scanning it, when it got scanned, so on and so forth, and make that transparent. And this organization, their goal of getting to 100% of those 150,000 assets in a year, they shortcut it by 11 months. So within a week of putting out that system, everyone said, well, yeah, it wasn't scanning at all. They were able to get full permission. They scanned everything by creating that transparency. So, when we talk about things like, Chaos Monkey, using these types of technologies to help build that resiliency and transparency inside the organization is, I think, a place that we all need to spend a few minutes of our lives in thinking about what we could do better. And as I said, there are other technologies. We at Tenable have a passive technology that allows people to have visibility for things that don't like to get scanned. There's this whole OT, industrial, industrial security, or operational technology systems that don't like to be scanned. Using passive technologies may be the best way to gain visibility, maybe keeping a strong inventory of those systems, maybe doing physical inventories. Highlighting all of these things is the first step. Being able to see that you have these challenges is the first step to coming up with a solution. So I had to skip a little bit. I talked pretty fast, but I think we got most of what I was trying to say, even though we lost about 10 minutes at the beginning. So as I said, that foreshadowing, I messed with their logo so they can't sue me. The idea is that we think different, right? Is that if you take 5 minutes of your day when you see these problems or you wonder what's going on, is you take a step back and you think about the problem in a different way, and maybe using some of the thoughts and ideas that I talked about, or if you want to learn a little bit more about my soapbox and ticketing, I'd be happy to talk about that at a later point with you overall. So that is my last slide. Hopefully for the last 20 minutes, I haven't been talking into a vacuum. I'm going to exit out of the full screen and see if there are any questions in the last 5 minutes we have overall. So let's go minus here and stop sharing. All right, good. No vacuum. So Any questions while we blaze through that rapid fire? And I didn't even have coffee yet. Imagine if I had had coffee, how much faster I could have gone. All right, so any questions? Type away. The unknown and the unknown, the unknown, unknown. I saw the movie the other day, a really good one, Vice. Rummy was in it, which was pretty funny. Will there be verification for the audience? I'd like to forward that to CompTIA. I don't know the answer to that question. Michelle, I think we'll get copies of these questions, and our Tech Accord person be able to talk about that. Yeah. 5-6 for those that wonder. Best practice for assessing cyber vulnerabilities. Yes, we'll have a post on that. The webinar series. I still can't hear or see the screen. Uh-oh. Is this being recorded? Yes. Jill will text him. I can see and tell him. Okay, works in Chrome after refreshing. All right, so let's go back down to the bottom. What PAM technologies is Tenable working with? Oh, the questions are coming in fast and furious. So yeah, so we work with Psychotic, Lieberman, Beyond Trust, and CyberArk, and we also work with a couple of the privilege escalation on. Oh geez, on the Unix systems, you know, like sudo, we work with a couple of those guys inside of there as well. So you could build sudo files to manage the proper permissions when running the scans there. So I think that's a pretty good deal as well. Let's see, someone asking about CPE credits. If we only open tickets for vulnerabilities that exceed policies, then how do you achieve SLAs? Great question. Don't know that I'm going to have time to crush that question in the whole 5 minutes, but think about this. If you're doing, and I skipped this part because of time, if you're doing scans a lot, and what I mean by scans a lot is daily. Why aren't we scanning daily? Why aren't we scanning every single day? The biggest reason people say we don't want to scan daily is because somehow people have connected scanning and reporting together. They're not the same. You can scan every day, but still report once a month. But when you have to be reactive, you have fresh data, not 38-day or 28-day-old data because you only scanned once a month. You can still report once a month. So if your SLA is to achieve that all of these systems have been patched within 30 days and you're scanning every day, the clock starts counting the day the vulnerability gets found, and the clock closes or the stopwatch stops when that vulnerability has been remediated, and there's what leads you into finding things that are 32 days old or 31 days old. So the key is that scanning isn't a problem. You scan a lot, and you scan way more frequently than most people think today, because people are petrified of scanning because if they think they scan, they think they have to report. And they are not the same. Scanning and reporting are connected, but they aren't dependent on one another overall. And I do think that's a huge issue that people don't consider all the time. If I scan everything, and the scan includes devices that cannot be patched like old printers and patch machines, yeah, you should scan them, but you exclude them from the reports. Back to that same comment that reporting and scanning are not connected to one another. Relationship to security center remains the same. I'm not sure I get what that one means, Leroy. Peter says, does it mean that you recommend that patch process must be vuln scan? No, that's the opposite. No, totally. No, I think the patch process needs to be disconnected from vuln scanning. If vuln scanning never existed, patching should still happen. You patch based on your policy or your procedures. Scans go on all by themselves. You don't need the two things to be together. At all. All right, let's see, in the couple minutes we have left, does it take longer than 24 to 48 hours for updates to happen? And they're talking about updates for new signatures to be released. Now, we're actually working on some pretty good statistics for this. We did a tremendous amount of research on the data last year, and we're going to have one of our early publications in 2019 kind of talking about the year in review from the research side. And we've invested tremendously heavily in the research over the last 18 months. Lots of new people, big data science guys, all sorts of writers to make the plugins. And anecdotally, we've been able to say that we've been out there first or nearly first with almost every major plugin or major vulnerability on the release. We don't have perfect coverage, nobody does, but we definitely have a very broad coverage and the highest coverage of CVEs. The timing of each depends. Like last week and the week and a half with Christmas and whatnot, we weren't releasing a lot of plugins. Our team was off. Lots of people aren't scanning. And lots of plugins or lots of CVEs aren't being released. So those types of moments are slow, but generally we're often to be one of the first people out there. And as I said, we'll have some materials to talk about that later in the year. And let's see, what's the best guide you can recommend for good patching practices? Well, we don't have a whole lot of time to think about this, but the biggest thing that you can think about is understanding why behavior around patching happens and doesn't happen. And you'll hear people think about this in all different ways, different opinions. And if you ask people inside of your organization, you know, what kind of effort can they make monthly? You might find that they might say, look, we can't do it monthly. We could only do it quarterly, or we could only do it every other month or every other week. Okay, and if everyone agrees that that's what we can afford to do right now, then that's where the policy starts. But what you would look to is how do we make that better next year? How do we make that better next quarter? How do we reduce that time next quarter? Is it hiring new people? Is it buying a better technology or a different technology? Being able to think about that. All right, folks, we've hit the top of the hour. I really appreciate everyone's patience. I was watching, we stayed about with a pretty high number throughout the disaster of getting this thing to work. But we really appreciate the number of attendees sticking through that part of the process. I hope you all found this valuable, and the Tech Accord and Tenable, thanks you very much. Have a great afternoon, everyone.